this idea that God rested, Adam and Eve, their creator, rested on the seventh day after all of his work. Do you think that's something that is sort of, we should have the idea that God, as a creator, if he rested, that means we also should rest?
Yeah, it seems to be the way that the story is being told in Genesis 1, where everything that is labeled good, and if you read, like, it's too often we unfortunately can read the Bible in a very sloppy way. We don't pay attention to the details, but the biblical authors are expecting us to pay attention to the details. And so you might have the impression that it's just like day one and God spoke and this came into being and it was good, and evening, morning, and the next day, blah, blah, blah. And it's just over and over again, this was good, and this is good, this is good. And it's not actually what happens. There are things that God does where he doesn't call it good. He doesn't say it's bad, but it's not good. And if you're paying attention to that, you should ask the question, well, he must not be arbitrarily calling everything he's doing in creation good. It's specific things that he's doing are good. And so then the question becomes, good for whom? Good for what? Right? If you're going to evaluate something, is this table good? Depends on what you want to use it for. Like, to use it as we're using it, it's great. If you want to use it as a bed, not so great. I can think of better places for a bed. And so, light and having the division between light and darkness is good. Who is that good for? Did God need light in order to see? No. He was totally aware, of where everything was before he turned the lights on. And so who needs light? We need light, right? But then the days when the world is divided simply between, waters below and waters above and a great expanse of sky between, he doesn't call that good. Because that image of a world that is nothing but like water world, with raging, roiling clouds in the sky and raging seas below, there's no place for man in that world. So he doesn't call that day good. Until he now brings up the land out of the water, now it's good. And then he brings green things out, things that we can eat. That's good. The animals, to be, companions and helpers in our tasks. That's good. All these other things are good, but some things are not good. And so it becomes really clear then when he gets to the last day of creating, the sixth day, and places man here and places him in like the most ideal spot on the whole creation, that this has all been, like, this is the crowning achievement. And if we go back to the temple language we were talking about last time, where, the creation of the skies and the land is some form of cosmic temple. It's a space from which God can come in and rest and fill this space, the way in the ancient, Near Eastern minds, that's what happened in a temple built by human hands. And just as in that culture, when you were constructing a temple, sort of the crowning piece, the final piece would be you'd install the image, the idol that represents that God, because the God is invisible. The God who fills the house is invisible. And so you make a visible thing, an idol, that you place in a position, in a place of prominence, in a place where everybody can see it, a high place maybe in the structure, that then represents that invisible God that you can't see. And usually, when we look at like ancient statues and things of gods, usually like they have some sort of animal features or other things about them. And those are intentionally pointing to some kind of, attributes or character of that God. When you see a statue of Zeus, there'll be things about that statue that kind of tell you who Zeus is. You may not have met Zeus, but when you look at his statue, you can get a little bit of an idea about who he is, what he's like. And in this story, that crowning moment is then when God says, yeah, I need an image too. I want to place an idol in my temple. And it's actually the word salam in Hebrew, which is the same word that we'll use later when God says, don't make images, don't make idols. It's salam. So we're not allowed to make images of God because God's already made an image of himself. And it's you, it's me, it's all humanity. And so he makes this human to be his idol image so that all creation and all the, the spiritual, like we're getting the, angelic beings and all that, when they look at us, they get an idea of what God's like. That was the intention.
Right.
That was the ideal.
Which ties into when he tells man their purpose is to fill the earth,
Right.
rule, subdue, multiply.
Yes.
What he's telling them is take that image that you've been
Mm-hmm.
created in, which is this image of God. And part of what I connect that to, what does it mean that mankind was created in this image? I think one aspect of that, maybe a major aspect, it would be the fruit of the Spirit that they were capable of manifesting. So
Yes.
love, joy, peace, patience,
Right.
kindness,
God's
goodness,
character.
gentleness, self-control. So God's character that mankind, in as much as they remained in that faith,
Right.
Sabbath, rest-like relationship with God, they were capable of spreading that. So everything God created, you're saying, he says it was good for them, for his image bearers.
Right.
And
so if God takes time to rest
right.
and just simply enjoy and reflect out who he is into the world, shouldn't we as his image bearers, wouldn't that make sense that, we would do like our Father does?
So we, as image bearers, as our Father does, should, again, going back to Sabbath, a simple definition of the word is to cease, to stop. So when God rested, God simply stopped. And so getting into in practical terms, what value does the Sabbath have? I think that really starts to get to it, because when you think about what that means for human beings, again, who are busy, we've got families, we've got work, we've got aspirations, we've got things we want to accomplish. And so the idea of Sabbath teaching us to be like our God, who you said in the last one, who knows when to say enough,
Yes.
who knows when to say, okay, that's good, and I'm going to stop and rest. And so Sabbath should teach us what it's meant to do, I think, in large part, right, is to remind us that our well-being, our accomplishing things, productivity, our identity, our everything that we strive for, everything that we work and exhaust ourselves to attain, the Sabbath should teach us to stop and remember, call to mind that all those things, our identity, our well-being, our productivity, ultimately that is God who...
He's the source.
He is the source of those.
Yes.
Sabbath reminds us that we aren't the source.
Right.
Sabbath is meant to remind us that God is the source.
He's the king, not us.
Yeah. So when we get then to the fourth commandment,
yes,
and one of the commandments of the 10 Commandments that I think it's interesting that is maybe for Christianity. Me growing up in the Christian church, I didn't really know what the Sabbath meant, really. And so it seems significant to me that the one of the 10 Commandments, the fourth commandment, again, it's I think it's the longest commandment. Is that right? In the 10 Commandments?
Is which one?
The fourth?
I think isn't this the 10th one pretty long?
Maybe it is. I don't know.
Because it goes into so much detail.
But when we get to the fourth...
Oh, no, there's a lot, yeah. There's a lot of
okay.
text. I'm just looking at it in the text. I don't tend to think of it, because what happens is we abbreviate.
Yeah.
When we post it on people's walls and in front of courthouses and all that, right? They don't actually write out the whole command.
Right.
And it is quite long.
It is long.
And it actually looks like it has a big, obvious callback to Genesis chapter 1 in it.
So what does that mean then? The fourth commandment. We have this command of God to Sabbath.
Yeah.
Why? Why would he command? Why would he put such an emphasis on rest? Why did he give that command to Israel?
Yes. So, my opinions have shifted over the years, as I continue to study and read more and read other places in Scripture that kind of refer back to this passage. And spend time reading like how rabbis teach, the understanding, because this, these 10 commandments, like this, for the Jewish people, even today, like this is what sums up what it means to be a Jew, is these 10 words, as they're called.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the 10 carefully, this again goes back to, being a careful reader of the text in Scripture. You see that the 10 is made up of 2 sets of 5. And people have noticed this, even people that aren't, deep Bible geeks or scholars or whatever, that, hey, it seems like the first 5 have to do with our vertical relationships.
Right.
And the second 5 seem to be more like peer-to-peer relationships, which is interesting. And so you see these 5 and these 5, and they kind of go 2 categories. And then you begin to wonder, do the 2 5s go together? Almost like a chiasm, but not ordered in the way you would order a chiasm. This is just a different kind of parallelism. And then if so, then that means that each one of the individual commandments is paired with another one that is teaching the same principle or concept, just oriented in a different way. One is oriented towards the vertical, one is oriented towards the horizontal. So the Sabbath is commandment number 4, so that would fall under the first 5.
Right.
So the Sabbath is giving us a principle about our vertical relationship with Him.
Our relationship with God is what you're saying.
Right. So that means that the 9th commandment would be the equivalent, how we practice Sabbath in relationship to you and to me, like to how we do it with each other. And what's the 9th commandment? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What? So this and keeping the Sabbath are the same principle. So, and I think that's the clue for us to understand why did God command the children of Israel to make such a big deal about this day? Because remember, one of the purposes, the chief purpose of what God's doing with Israel is what? It's not just blessing Israel just to bless them. They're to be a blessing that ultimately blesses all the nations. Like, they are part of the vehicle for God's salvation plan for the whole earth. And they are to be, He's already said this in this story in Exodus, just, 2 chapters before, or 1 chapter before, that His intention for them is to be a kingdom of priests. And so they're going to be, what do priests do? I think we've already talked about this before too. The priests mediate that relationship between God and people. And so Israel, as a nation, is going to be communicating something about who God is to the rest of the nations around them. And they're also going to be the vehicle for bringing the other nations, drawing them in to community and fellowship with the God who made the skies and the land.
Yep.
And so, I understand what it means not to bear false witness against you, my neighbor against you. That means I don't say things about you that aren't true. I don't misrepresent your character, your actions, your words. And if I do, bearing false witness means I'm actually actively telling people things. Jordan said this or Jordan did that, and it's not true. That's not who you are. You would never say that or do that. And there's something about the Sabbath, that's how we keep the Sabbath, is preaching a message to the nations, for Israel.
About God.
About who God is. And that if they don't keep the Sabbath, they're actually lying about who God is.
That's powerful.
Isn't it? It blew me away when I saw that.
So not resting in God. So going back to kind of what I mentioned earlier, we get so caught up in our own self-reliance and our efforts to be productive. And you can put this in different in different arenas. You can put this in a physical arena where you're just striving and efforting to provide for your family.
Do you ever hear the word I've come across here in the U.S., self-made man?
Yeah, self-made. Exactly.
Right?
So you can be striving in that way to be a self-made man, to be accomplished, and all the while forgetting your maker.
Yes.
But you can do that in the religious arena too, where I'm
earning all this.
You're earning this. You're thinking that I'm doing something. I am I'm the one whose responsibility it is to make this good.
I got myself out of Egypt.
Right, exactly. So it's self-righteousness ultimately, and wherever that falls, whatever our lack of rest in God looks like, at the end of the day, what it's saying is my success, my safety, my peace of mind, my peace in life, my security relies on me and what I'm able to do. And so when God tells us to Sabbath or to rest, that's a reminder that no, isn't it Matthew 6? Isn't this just what Jesus is saying when he says, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear. And at the end of that,
it's the idea of trusting God.
Trusting God like a child.
Yes.
And so when what you're saying with the Ten Commandments, making that connection between the ninth commandment is that when we don't do that, when we don't rest in God and live a life where our hearts are reminding ourselves and we're trusting like a child in God, that is saying something about God and who He is. We by our lack of rest in God are saying something about Him. So what is it?
Right.
What is it that we're saying about Him?
Right. Not good things when we practice that.
Yeah.
We're misrepresenting who our Father is, and He takes that seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, there's such a huge block of text about that and going all the way back, because I think what, God is doing in this, so this would be Exodus 20 verses 8 through, 11. And, I'll just read that whole command. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And so the other words, we, you don't forget about it. Like you intentionally bring it to mind. Right. That's what that word remember means. In order to keep it special, to keep it set apart, keep it unique. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. So you got plenty of time during the week to get all the stuff you need to get done. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter. Like, so you can't say, okay, I'm going to rest, but my kids are going to be working the fields, right? Or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. In other words, your whole, they don't even have cities of their own yet, but God's looking forward and saying, even when you have your own cities, you're not going to get around this by making somebody else work for you as if they're not a part of this, but you are. This is for everyone. God is the God of everyone. For in 6 days, Yahweh made the sky and the land and the sea and all that is in them and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So again, it's that reminder that all this stuff is here. The land, the sea, the sky, it's all here because of Yahweh. And He made it for a purpose. And He made us for a purpose, and we're recognizing His supremacy and His authority in our lives.
So, self-reliance and God-reliance. It's this idea of it's interesting that God, like you said, God wasn't letting anybody out of it. It's and this emphasis on remember. So it's that God wants us to be a kind of people who remember, bring specifically to remembrance who God is, and who we are, to bring ourselves into a proper perspective again of who God is and who we are, and who we aren't. That we aren't our own provider. We aren't our own savior. We aren't our own redeemer. And so that emphasis on remember is like God saying, this is very important. As human beings, it's again, I think the fact that rest is found in the creation narrative way back at the beginning, it's like the way God created mankind in this creation is that restfulness in God is woven into creation itself. And they're intricately linked so that if you don't have rest, it doesn't work correctly.
Right. Everything goes haywire.
And so the fourth commandment is about that. It's God commanding us to stop, to cease, and to remember who he is.
Yes.
And to remember where our well-being, our safety and security comes from. That at the end of the day, it doesn't rely on us and what we're able to do, what we're able to accomplish. It depends on who God is and ultimately what he has already done for us.
Yes.
It's the fact that God has already done something for us that enables us to be people who can constantly rest. And so for Israel, they had this specific day, that was to remind us. But if I think even for them, if we only rest on one day and think that, okay, I've done my Sabbath duty for the week, it would almost be a parallel to the way the Jews with the command of do not commit adultery would say, okay, well, I'm not committing the physical act of adultery.
Ooh.
So
are you getting the Sermon on the Mount?
Right. And so, I've done my part of keeping that commandment.
But have you kept it here?
Have you kept it here? Have you kept it in your heart?
Yeah.
And if you only relate to God in a restful way, one day a week even, I think we're missing it, right?
You can go through the motions and still not be remembering.
Right. So what this tells me though, is that the fourth commandment, the commandment about Sabbath, is not about, or maybe let me just ask you, is it about going to church?
No.
So why?
Not at all.
Why do so many people think that? Why?
Oh my goodness.
Where does that come from?
That's, at this point, we're talking centuries of church tradition. And I think if you trace back for those Christian groups that have sort of abandoned the seventh day and embraced the eighth day as the Sabbath, it usually goes back to some leader that had a serious problem with the Jewish people, to be blunt, and wanted to make it really clear, we're not with them, we have nothing to do with them.
To disconnect from.
It's a disconnect. You see this actually happen then even forward when Islam enters the stage. So by that point, we're in the 6th century. And so, of course, the Jews are still at that point, observing the Sabbath on the Sabbath. And, a lot of Christians in that region are instead gathering and celebrating on the 8th day. And so what day do you think is special in the week to the Muslim people?
Tell me.
The 6th. The 6th is their Sabbath.
Okay.
Because they couldn't do the 7th because they didn't want to be worshiping on the same day, gathering congregational on the same day as the Jews. And they didn't want to do it on the first day of the week or the 8th day, depending how you look at it, because they didn't want to be, associated with the Christians. And so they chose the day on the other side. The Christians took the day after the Sabbath. The Muslims took the day before the Sabbath. And that's when the big congregational gathering is in the mosque every week.
Okay. So there's a lot of questions I'm anxious to get to. I want to pick your brain about relating to a lot of those things and even the history. But when I kind of look at this idea that Sabbath is a gift to mankind, I think it's not this burdensome obligation.
Not at all.
It's something that is meant to be a blessing that refreshes us. And I think as a Christian, I often will say, I keep the Sabbath every day. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Like what when you hear that?
Yeah.
Do you think is that biblical?
I certainly couldn't say that just based on, you making that statement. Well, I would love to hear what does that look like?
Yeah.
I run into people who, either say something like that, or say they keep a Sabbath but not on a Saturday, for example. What I want to know is, okay, what does that mean for you? What does that look like? What is that doing? And I think that's why it's significant. I think for us to understand what the purpose of keeping the Sabbath for Israel was. That there's a principle there. There's a principle. There's a message that is being proclaimed by a life that is lived that has this kind of pattern or rhythm to it to everyone else who might be watching. And so, do I think that everyone has to do it exactly the same way? If you're not a Jew, no.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're an Israelite, well, I think you have the Torah tells you what to do. But if you're not an Israelite, if you're simply a Christ follower, whether you come from a pagan background or a secular background or a Muslim background, I think what matters more to us is the principle here, and the principle is, am I living a life in such a way that people who are observing me are able to discern things about the God I serve that are true.
And what is it, if you're following that principle, as you should, what is it that people will discern about the God you serve?
They will discern that he is a God who is a good father, who wants to have time with us, to have the quality time with us. I love how it's such an odd thing. It's not what you expect if you're reading carefully in the Exodus story, but the first time that Moses comes to Pharaoh to ask for the people's release, he doesn't say, let my people go so that we can go conquer the land of Canaan and make a nation for ourselves. He says, our God has summoned us to the wilderness in order to celebrate with him, which was just like speaking Greek to Pharaoh's ears. Like, what in the world? There's no God. Gods don't want to have parties with people in the desert.
Especially in the desert. Right? That's
like, what in the world? Yeah. Right. Like, what in the world? And like, it's for real. And like, and he actually calls his God by name, and he uses language to say that our God sees us as his children, and he wants to go on a retreat with us and have a party.
Yeah.
Because that's how much he loves being with us. And that's like... And like Pharaoh had no grid for that, which is why he's like, not only is the answer no, but you guys are having crazy daydreams out there. You must have way too much rest. I'm going to take away all your rest because rest isn't good for you.
Yes. So if you are obeying that principle of Sabbath, what you're kind of saying maybe, or correct me if I'm wrong, is that what it tells the world is that our God is a God who likes us to enjoy relationship with him.
Yes.
And is a God who delivers us from our bondages, is a God who takes care of us.
Absolutely.
The God we serve is like a really good dad, so that I don't have to stress and worry so much like the rest of the world does. I don't have to get so anxious and fearful about finances or sicknesses or bills to pay, or anything. And again, relating to this to the religious people, I don't have to worry so much about, am I not sinning enough, or am I being holy enough?
Right, because you can keep the Sabbath and bear false witness.
Yes.
Because what you just described, that way of keeping Sabbath is a way that speaks something truthful about who God is, like we were discussing. But you can keep a Sabbath day in such a way that what it communicates to everyone around you is you follow a God who's all about like rules and rule keeping.
Exactly.
And if he catches you doing, mowing your lawn on Saturday, he's going to strike you down like, scary, or he's going to punish you in eternity. I mean, there's a way to do it that's wrong.
So keeping the Sabbath, okay, I'm going to get specific again, because so much of the conversations going on in this channel are related to the World Mission Society Church of God. But what you just said, this is a prime example of that. So their Sabbaths, what they revolve around is being in their Zions, which is their church. Their members have to be there from morning to night, just hours upon hours. And what they do is they study. Tithing. Tithing is a big deal to them. And there's this list.
That's really interesting.
There's this list of requirements, right? And so we've talked to, we have former members who will tell us that, like, for them, when they were in that group, Saturdays, they're Sabbath days. And again, for this group, Sabbath is a big emphasis. Like they act as if this is a big deal to them. They're very passionate about the fourth command.
Sure.
members will tell us that for them, Saturdays were the most exhausting, burdensome day of their week.
Which sounds like the opposite of Sabbath.
It's the opposite. And so when you say that you can keep the Sabbath in a way where you're actually bearing false witness about God,
Yeah.
isn't that what
Yes.
that is?
I think you're not remembering the Sabbath. You're misremembering the
Right.
Sabbath.
Because what are you doing if your Sabbath days, your days of rest, are filled with
Trying to prove yourself.
trying to prove yourself to God?
Yeah.
And
And God's
doing all
story
these
is you don't
things.
have to prove anything.
Right.
You just have to be with me.
And that's the point of the Sabbath. Isn't that what the command of the Sabbath is for?
Yes.
It's not a command from a strict God who wants all these rules and obligations perfectly fulfilled.
Right.
But it's a command from God to, again, remember who I am. Remember what I'm like. Remember my good character. Remember that I'm like a good dad
Yeah.
who is going to take care of you.
Yeah.
And so to break the Sabbath, to disobey the Sabbath, doesn't just look like not observing Sabbath on Saturday, but it could mean you're doing things that you think are keeping the Sabbath, but all the while what you're doing is you're making this statement
Yeah.
about God that says he's not good. He's not good enough to provide for me. I have to do my part.
Right.
And you anxiously strive and effort to do what God has already freely done for us.
Right. Which is sad.
Which is sad.
It's very sad.
And it doesn't lead to rest. It leads to
Burnout, I would think.
burnout. Yeah. You said something about Pharaoh and Moses and that interaction and the release of Israel from bondage
Yes.
to into freedom. And so the Sabbath, do you feel like in a way the Sabbath, resting in God, does it have anything to do with this idea of bondage and slavery and
Sure.
Sabbath being a reminder
Absolutely.
in that regard?
Absolutely.
So talk about that.
Well, I mean, I think we see it in, when I read the verse, when it goes down to specific details about, sons and daughters, and even about your male and female servants, and even your livestock. It's that reminder that we may, because of, position or privilege, at times look and feel as if we are superior to those around us, and we can, use and exploit animals and people around us as we will. But the reality is, the Sabbath day is the reminder that the reality is we're all equal before God. And we're all free. We were made free. And we sometimes end up, as Israel did, to quote now the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
There's something to that.
There's something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, if you connect that to the gospel, which I think is a good connection to make, you see Paul talking over and over in the New Testament about our once being slaves of sin, but now we are slaves to righteousness. We've been freed from our bondage to sin.
Right.
As children of God.
Yes.
And so do you think then Sabbath actually involves an aspect of freedom from sin? Does it relate to our freedom and rest that we have from our bondage to the taskmaster of sin?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't think that's how, Jews 2,000 years ago who are reading Exodus, are thinking of it in that way, right? But at the same time, it's not as if they're ignorant of the symbolism that Egypt and later Babylon, carry with them, and that, disobedience and rebellion, which idolatry, which are just forms of that sin takes, are their own slave master in a way, and that they will grind you into dust given enough time, and that God's intention for man is to be set free from. He wants to set all the people free. He wants to set Egypt free from Egypt.
Right.
He wants to heal Babylon from Babylon's wounds. Because all of these empires, human empires, all end up the same way.
So let me read something here that I think touches on some of what you just mentioned about slavery. So Deuteronomy 12, I think, kind of relates to all this, starting in verse 12 of chapter 5. Says, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So it's interesting that he says, therefore, because of
which
this
is different
reason,
than what we read in Exodus 20.
It's different, right? What did we read in Exodus 20?
Which one is it?
Yeah. So what did it say in Exodus 20?
So in Exodus 20, the reason, the rationale behind the Sabbath is what?
It's because God made
the heavens and the
heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh.
Right. Therefore, he blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy because in 6 days. But now it's here because he led you out of Egypt. So which is it, Jordan?
Right. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. What was wrong with Moses?
Right.
Did he forget what he wrote 2 books ago? It was a really long time in the desert.
Or maybe
it's a nuanced issue. Maybe there's more dimensions to this.
Maybe it's both.
Maybe they're all true.
Yeah. But it's fascinating to me. And again, I think it shows just how important this concept of Sabbath is, how it runs through all of Scripture. Even when Sabbath, that specific word may not appear, it's this principle that you see all the way through the Bible. And the importance of it, you see when Israel would stop keeping the Sabbath, you see the downfall and the movement towards sin that would happen as a result of that. But it's interesting that it says, therefore, so because God brought Israel out of the land of Egypt, he says, remember that you were a slave.
Yeah.
God brought you out of that slavery with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So again,
you're not slaves anymore.
Yeah.
Be free.
And doesn't this go back to what we've been talking about the character of God, that the Sabbath day is a day that you remember that God is a God who frees us from our slavery.
Freedom day.
It's freedom, right?
Yeah.
That God's the one. Israel didn't deliver themselves out of Egypt.
Not at all.
They didn't have to do anything except for whine and cry and become afraid, and then God delivered them.
Yeah.
But it's so fascinating to me that he says this is at least part of why the Sabbath is so important, because it pushes us to remember the kind of God that we serve, a God who over and over and over again saves us, delivers us.
Yes.
Not just in the way of parting Red Seas, but in everyday practical life where the fears and the anxieties of life, the burdens of family issues, health issues, or the struggles with sin, the struggles with guilt, the struggles with temptation, and all these things that I think Sabbath is key. Remembering again, the command is to remember. God commands us in those moments of struggle and difficulty, doesn't he, to remember who he is, remember the kind of God he is, and then that's
like the key word in Deuteronomy, isn't it? Remember.
It's constantly that push to remember. Remember what God has done for you, and then know that that's the kind of God he still is.
Right, he's consistent.
Yeah.